1, 2, 3, 4. There are 3 knocks on your door. 5, 6, 7, 8. He came in through the garden gate. 9, 8, 7, 6. Just be good and cross your sticks. 5, 4, 3, 2, or in he'll come to knock on you. Lena heard her mother's voice singing in her head as she stood on the old battered porch outside of her childhood home. The rhyme haunted her throughout her life, finding its way into her head when she was driving to the grocery store. It would sneak up on her while she was washing the dishes. It would whisper to her in her sleep, finding its way into even the most pleasant of dreams. Every day, at one point or another, Lena would hear her mother's eerie rhyme and momentarily lose her breath. Sometimes she would pinch herself to snap out of it. At other times she found herself so shaken, so chilled to the bone, that she would light the fire in the hearth and huddle close to it, even in the middle of July in Texas. Lena's mother, Elaine, was crazy. No, not your everyday, my mom is crazy, I don't want to talk about it sort of crazy. No, Elaine was the kind of crazy that landed Lena in years of therapy, years of people digging around in her brain trying to repair it. Pill after pill had been handed to her. A pill to help her sleep, a pill to calm her down, a pill to help her stop thinking. Sometimes they would help a little. She would feel better for a few months, maybe even a year. The rhyme that bounced inside her skull would get quieter, almost letting her believe that one day it would go away. After those few months of hope and reprieve, however, the rhyme would start to drum louder inside of her head. It was infuriating. It would never leave her alone. It was that terrible song that spirals over and over inside of your brain, never going away and never being replaced by anything better. Lena didn't even know what the stupid thing meant. Was it a code? Was it some secret that her mother was trying to reveal to her? Or was it just crazy babbling that her mother would prattle on about when she was falling into one of her episodes? Lena asked her about it once, but her mother just went pale, and her eyes fell away to a spot on the wall behind her. Her face became dark, as though someone was watching her and had just heard a dangerous secret. She shook her head and just told Lena that she had never heard that rhyme in her life. She then laughed and walked into the other room, as though Lena was the one with a few bolts loose. At certain moments in time, she questioned if maybe she was. Lena's real name was Angelina. Angelina Elaine Waverly, to be exact. She hated all of it. Her mother would call her Angie for short, which Lena hated even more. It was the name of a second-hand Barbie doll, lying on the ground of some clumsy little girl's room, with her hair disheveled and her arm twisted above her head. She hated the name Angie. She hated it all of her life. So much so that when she went into kindergarten, she told all of the kids that her name was Lena. Thanks to whatever force lies in whatever heaven there may be, it stuck, and she was Lena ever since. So here Lena was, standing on the porch, facing the door to her childhood nightmares, being faced with a brand new terror, guilt. She hadn't spoken with her mother in over 2 years. Elaine called her weekly, without fail, but Lena no longer answered, though she used to. For years she would answer, and she would talk her mother off of whatever cliff she happened to be standing on that day. The conversations were always the same. Her mother would start by sounding interested in Lena's life. She would ask about her husband, Michael. She would ask about her job and the new baby, but within 5 minutes she would be crying. Sometimes she would talk about the man that wouldn't stop knocking on her bedroom door. Sometimes she would just babble incoherently. Lena knew there wasn't a man at her bedroom door. There never had been. Even when she was a little girl, there hadn't been. She would peek into the hall, toward her mother's closed and bolted door. She would listen to her mother scream and wail, telling the man to leave her alone, telling him to stop banging. Lena never heard the banging, though. She never even heard a knock, and there definitely was never a man. So Lena finally just stopped answering the phone. There would always be a voicemail. She would always delete it. Her finger would always hesitate for a brief moment, however. There would always be that wave of anxiety and guilt. There would always be that momentary thought, maybe this is the real one. Maybe this is the one I really need to answer. Sometimes you can feel as though you need permission to move on. You can feel like someone needs to tell you it's okay to get over it and start building your own life. Michael gave that to her, every week, without fail, and that's how her thumb would finally press delete. Then one week, just last month, she didn't get a call. She didn't really notice, not at first. There were no sirens that went off. There was no internal feeling of disorder. Quite the opposite, actually. She had a really good week for the first time in a long time, and she couldn't pinpoint why. Then there wasn't a call the next week, and something scratched at the back of her brain. Something was missing. Something wasn't right. It wasn't until the third week that it finally clicked. It was exactly 3:30 on a Tuesday morning when Lena's eyes shot open and her heart was pounding in her chest. The rhyme within her dreams had been the loudest she had ever heard. It was screaming at her in 1,000 voices, knocking around in her brain and chasing her through all of her thoughts. Even worse than the rhyme, however, was the loud knock on her bedroom door that shook her awake. She sat silently in bed, wondering if it had just been in her dreams. She couldn't open her mouth or move. She sat staring at the ceiling with wide open eyes, using all of her mental power to will her husband awake, which of course never worked. So she continued to breathe and listen closely to the silence of her apartment. Just as logic began to win, telling her that she was obviously dreaming, and thank goodness she didn't wake up Michael, she heard the knock again. It wasn't a pounding or even a thumping. It was so light, she almost missed it, but it was definitely there. She shot up in bed and, being unable to scream or even speak, began slapping her hand on Michael's chest to wake him up. Michael checked the house reluctantly. At first, he told her there was nothing there. She was just hearing the noises of the house settling. He told her to go back to sleep. But Lena insisted, and her tone made him realize he would never get any sleep unless he caved. He checked the doors. He checked the windows. Lena made him check all of the closets in every single room. He even checked the dresser drawers. It was during this investigation, that of course turned up nothing, that Lena finally realized what had been bothering her the past few weeks. She hadn't received a single call from her mother. She hadn't received one single voicemail. Something was definitely wrong. The lady who delivered Elaine's mail was the one who found her. She was slumped over against a pillow in her bed as the flies had their way with her. The mail had simply piled too high, and Linda, the mail courier, knew something wasn't quite right. She knew Elaine, not like a friend, but like a neighbor knows another neighbor, particularly if they're crazy. It was for this reason that she chose to enter the house when the door was unlocked, and continued looking around even though no one seemed to be home. Linda was a good woman. She went to church, she had 3 kids, she liked romance novels, and she baked treats for all of her neighbors on the weekends. She also liked to gossip with those neighbors, usually about Elaine. Nothing could have prepared Linda for the corpse that she found in that back bedroom. Nothing could wipe the memory away. Consequently, Linda's baking never quite tasted the same, and now the neighbors usually gossiped without her. That was how this moment of truth was thrust upon Lena. Out of nowhere, life had changed, and now was the moment she would see if she had changed with it. She turned the knob and let the old door swing noisily open. She even let it bump against the inside wall without trying to stop it, causing the old glass to rattle in its frame. She took 2 steps, moving through the doorway and into the house, before stopping and looking around. amazed. It was her mother's house. The furniture was the same, the pictures that lined the walls were the same, even her mother's umbrella, which she would carry around on sunny days just in case, but always forget when it was raining, sat in the same corner of the small foyer that it had for years. There were definite things that had changed, however, things that made Lena anxious and rattled her stomach around. First, there was a definite smell that permeated the small house, filling the air like a candle that had been left to burn for far too long. It was a smell of death. It filled her nostrils and coated the air around her face. It was so thick that if she closed her nose and breathed through her mouth, the pungent aroma would cling to her tongue like a greasy film. The second, and more bothersome thing, were the pictures against the wall. They were the same photos that had always been there. Lena's father holding her as a baby, her mother touching his shoulder gently while they smiled toward the camera, as well as Lena's unfortunate third-grade portrait, taken on a particularly bad day and Lena's least favorite. All of them were there. However, every photo inside the house had been turned upside down. Every single painting had been twisted onto its head. Even the decorated cross that hung over the fireplace had been turned over, sending chills down Lena's back and causing small bumps to cascade down her arms. The third, and by far most troublesome discovery, were the new additions that hung from the ceiling, from the lamps, from the mantel over the fireplace, and along every doorway in the house. Everywhere that Lena looked, small branches had been tied together to form a triangle that hung along every inch of the house. "What the hell were you doing, Mom?" Lena whispered to herself, as her feet finally released themselves from the floor and she took a few hesitant steps further. She heard what sounded like whispering coming from down the hall in her mother's room. It made her pause and listen, her heart thumping wildly in her chest. 1, 2, 3, 4, the whispers said, over and over. Lena shook her head and rubbed angrily at her eyes. This was all becoming too much for her. She was here to do a very specific job. She just needed to get it done and get out. "Pull yourself together," she said firmly, and then forced her feet to march directly to her mother's room, where she swung open the door. The curtains were pulled shut, only leaking in a small stream of light that barely lit the room. The smell hit her in the face like a baseball bat, causing her to cough and plug her nose. Thankfully, the sheets had been stripped from the bed, but a large, hard-to-ignore stain coated the top of the mattress at one side. Empty boxes were scattered across the room, and the same triangles were hung across the ceiling and the door. Lena took the deepest breath her stomach would allow and walked to the bedside table where a small glass bottle with a pink candle sat. She picked it up and read the label out loud. "Cherry Blossom Clouds." "Nice, Mom," she said, rolling her eyes. She grabbed one of the matches out of the drawer and lit it, hoping the smell would eventually mask the thick odor of the room. Lena sighed and walked over to the closet. She grabbed a handful of her mother's clothes and threw them into a box on the floor. The closet was overflowing with clothes. Her mother had never been able to say no to a blouse, or any form of clothing for that matter, and Lena was beginning to realize just how long this process was going to take. As she shuffled things around, mentally cataloging what would need to be sold and what should be kept, she heard the sound of a door behind her. She turned around just in time to see the bedroom door slam itself shut. Lena had seen moments like this in the movies. She always swore she would be the first person out of the room. She was disappointed to find that she was one of the stupid girls, as she called them. She just stood there, staring at the door, as though at any moment it would apologize and explain itself. 5, 6, 7, 8, a voice whispered from the closet. Lena jumped back and tripped over the box at her feet, sending her flying onto the stain-covered mattress. She jumped up as fast as she could and ran toward the door. She finally had the guts she lacked just moments before to run the hell away. Just as she reached it, however, a loud banging smashed against it 3 times. It was so hard that it shook the door against the hinges, causing small splinters of wood to fall on the floor. 9876, 9876, the voices sang loudly from behind her, their chanting getting louder and louder. Who's there? Lena screamed at the door, her voice shaking so much she didn't even recognize it. There were 3 more slams against the door, this time even harder and louder than the last, causing a crack to form along the doorframe. Stop it! Go away! Lena screamed, suddenly realizing that she sounded exactly like her mother. She began to sob uncontrollably, collapsing onto the bed and holding her hands over her ears as the chanting continued. She didn't care that she was sitting on the bed with a stain. She didn't care about any of her mother's belongings. She just wanted whatever was out there to go away, and she would leave and never come back. They could burn the house down for all she cared. Set every memory of her childhood on fire and let it burn. That would be fine with her. Just let her leave. Please stop, Lena whispered through her sobs. Everything went quiet. The chanting stopped, and Lena sat for what seemed an eternity waiting for the banging, which never came. She opened her eyes and found the room was now covered in a bright light. The shades along the windows had somehow been drawn, letting sunlight pour into the stale, dark room. She could see tiny specks of dust floating inside of the golden rays, as if suspended in time. And then she heard her mother. Angie? Angie, sweetie, her mother's voice asked. Lena's heart broke, and she began to sob even harder, looking around the room with wild eyes as she searched for someone she knew couldn't possibly be there. Mom? Lena asked through her tears. Mom, is that you? Angie, you have to leave, sweetie. You have to get out, understand? Elaine said, sounding far away. Lena had no idea what was real and what was illusion any longer. She had absolutely no answers about anything that was happening around her. What she did know was that the slamming against the door, the whispering, and her mother's voice were the solid truths of whatever reality she was currently in. So, she didn't stop to ask questions or try to figure out why she was hearing whispers or how her mother was talking to her. She watched a lot of movies, and she hated it when people did that shit. She wasn't going to waste any time. She wiped her eyes as she shot up from the bed and ran to the door and reached for the doorknob. Just as her fingertips brushed the smooth brass of the handle, something slammed against the door again, this time blowing it completely off of its hinges. The full force of the door smashed against her, knocking her across the room and slamming her into the wall. Debris from the door flew around the room, knocking against the walls and furniture, as well as a small pink candle on the bedside table. Its flame brushed against the fibers of the carpet as it fell, slowly setting the floor ablaze. Lena collapsed and let out a loud moan as she rolled over and put her hands against her head. The room was spinning around her, and tiny lights flickered in her eyes as her vision momentarily went white. As everything slowly came back into a blurry view, Lena saw the tall man in the doorway slowly step into the room. His cold, wide eyes stared at her as he jerkily moved his legs. He took stiff steps toward her, one at a time, inching closer and closer as he walked straight through the growing flames. His body was completely uncovered. Lena could see every inch of gray flesh and muscle vibrate and twitch as he marched through the room like a stiff corpse. She felt as though she couldn't breathe. All of the life had been knocked out of her. She wanted to scream, but more than that, she wanted to run. She wanted to get up, grab a broken board from the door and smash it against the man as hard as she could. All she could muster, however, was a tiny squeak as she groggily pushed herself back against the wall. Angie, run! She heard her mother's voice scream again. It was much closer and louder this time than the previous, sounding as though she was in the room with her. Lena looked toward the direction of the voice and watched as her mother materialized from the shadows. She charged across the room at the man, smashing into him at full force and knocking him back into the closet. She turned to Lena, her eyes wide and face sunken in. "Run, Angie! Go!" she screamed, her mouth opening so wide with each word that it looked as though her jaw was coming unhinged. Lena pushed herself up off the floor and stumbled across the room as the tall man began to pull himself up as well. Lena wanted to look back toward her mother. She wanted to see her one last time, just to tell her how much she did actually love her and that she missed her. But she couldn't bring herself to stop. It was as though the moment her feet actually began to move, nothing would stop them. They ran her out of the room and then through the house. Going faster and faster, she came closer to the door. They didn't stop once they reached the porch. They didn't stop when she reached the road. They didn't even stop when they heard her mother's piercing, wailing scream from inside the house. They just kept running until she was all the way down the street and too winded to run any further. She turned back to look down the road toward her mother's house. Slowly she saw smoke begin to billow up into the sky, and after a few moments heard the siren of fire trucks growing closer and closer. She slowly walked back down the road, only approaching after the fire trucks had reached the house and hoses were drenching the flames that had somehow engulfed her entire childhood home in a matter of moments. She watched the firemen as they danced around the flames, slowly defeating the massive fire. Everything seemed to move in slow motion around her as she sat and stared blankly at the world, which from that moment on had forever changed. She watched them run in and out of the house. She watched them smash at the glass of the windows to get further into rooms they couldn't reach. She watched as the ash was carried up into the heavens by the smoke and heat. She watched as the tall man slowly walked out of the house, dragging something bulky and heavy in a sheet behind him. She watched as the firemen ran around him and through him without even a clue. She watched him slowly twitch and vibrate as he marched around to the back of the house. She watched as he slowly disappeared into the woods behind it. She watched all of this not knowing what was real, not knowing what she was even watching, and not knowing what she would see in the future. She just kept watching.